Before the Civil War swept through Alabama, there existed a plantation where the natural order of human relationships had been corrupted beyond recognition. Court documents sealed for 90 years speak of a woman who orchestrated something so profoundly disturbing that 3 separate judges refused to allow the testimony to be recorded in full. The few surviving fragments mention unnatural breeding practices, forced unions between blood relations, and a systematic program that violated every moral boundary known to civilized society. What made this case particularly haunting wasn't just what happened. It was who orchestrated it and how she convinced an entire community to look the other way for nearly 2 decades. The details that follow come from recently unsealed depositions, plantation ledgers marked with coded entries, and testimonies so disturbing that the court reporter added a personal note calling them the darkest revelations I have witnessed in 30 years of service. Before we continue with the history of Fair Hope Plantation and the woman they called the Mistress of Increase, if you're hearing this from Alabama or anywhere in the Deep South, leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. Hit that subscribe button because stories like this deserve to be remembered, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. And if you think you know where this is heading, I promise you don't. The truth is always darker than we imagine. What happened at Fair Hope would force us to confront just how far human depravity could extend when power faced no consequences and when profit eclipsed every moral consideration. Fair Hope Plantation Satan 12,200 acres of prime cotton land in Wilcox County, Alabama, where the Alabama River curved through soil so rich it turned black after rain. The plantation had been established in 1803 by Colonel James Sutherland, a Revolutionary War veteran who built his fortune on cotton and maintained a reputation for stern but fair treatment of his workforce. By the time of his death in 1839, Fair Hope was one of the most productive plantations in the county with 97 enslaved people working the fields and maintaining an operation that generated wealth substantial enough to support Theclinell's widow in considerable comfort. That widow was Margaret Sutherland, though everyone in Wilcox County knew her simply as Mistress Margaret. She was 41 years old when her husband died, leaving her sole ownership of the plantation and everything on it. She had been born Margaret Elizabeth Hargrave in Charleston, South Carolina, the daughter of a cotton broker who had made and lost 3 separate fortunes before drinking himself to death. She'd married Colonel Sutherland at 19, moving to Alabama with the eagerness of a woman escaping a past she never discussed. In the 22 years after marriage, she had borne him 5 children, 4 sons, and 1 daughter. The sons were Thomas, aged 20 at the time of their father's death, William, 18, Benjamin, 16, and Robert, 14. The daughter, Catherine, was only 12. Portraits commissioned in 1838, showed the family in their finest clothes, arranged around the colonel with the practiced formality of Southern aristocracy. Margaret sat beside her husband with her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in an expression that suggested neither warmth nor coldness, just careful control. What those portraits didn't show was the tension that had existed in the Sutherland household for years. Colonel Sutherland had been a firm believer in discipline and propriety. He tended church every Sunday, maintained strict moral standards for his household, and held definite opinions about the proper running of a plantation. His wife rarely contradicted him in public, but household slaves would later testify to arguments behind closed doors, heated discussions about money, about management, about the proper way to handle what the colonel called plantation discipline. When the colonel died of a sudden fever in March 1839, there was a proper period of mourning. Margaret wore black for the required year. She managed the plantation through an overseer, a hard-faced man named Jonas Pritchard, who had worked at Fair Hope for 7 years. For the first 2 years after her husband's death, life at Fair Hope continued much as it had before. Then in the spring of 1841, Mistress Margaret dismissed Jonas Pritchard. She told the neighboring planters that she wanted to manage Fair Hope more directly, that she felt an overseer was an unnecessary expense when she had 4 strong sons who could help her run the operation. This was unusual, but not unheard of. Widows sometimes took more active roles in plantation management. What people noticed though was that Thomas, her eldest son, seemed uncomfortable with his mother's increased involvement. He'd been preparing to attend the University of Alabama, but those plans were quietly abandoned. He remained at Fair Hope, where his mother kept him busy with tasks that seemed designed to keep him close to home. Wilcox County in the 1840s was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, at least among the white families who controlled the land. Plantations were separated by miles but connected through a tight web of social obligations. Church services, cotton sales, hunting parties, occasional balls in the county seat of Camden. Gossip traveled these networks with remarkable efficiency, and by late 1841, people were beginning to talk about changes at Fairhope. The first whispers concerned Mistress Margaret's sons. Thomas had always been quiet, but now he seemed withdrawn, rarely appearing at social gatherings. When he did attend church, he sat with his jaw clenched and eyes fixed on the pulpit, as if forcing himself to focus. William and Benjamin seemed to follow their older brother's lead, developing a guardedness that neighbors found strange. Only young Robert, still a boy of 15, maintained something of his earlier liveliness, though even he had become more subdued. The second set of whispers was more disturbing. They concerned changes in how Fairhope managed its enslaved population. In most plantation communities, there was a brutal frankness about the realities of slavery. The buying, selling, and breeding of human beings was discussed with the same casual efficiency as any other agricultural matter. But what Margaret was doing seemed different. She'd begun tracking the women on her plantation with unusual intensity, keeping detailed records of their monthly cycles, their health, their age. She'd separated the youngest and strongest women into a specific quarter away from the main slave cabins. And then there was the matter of the bloodlines. On most plantations, the enslaved population included people of varying complexions, some darker, some lighter, reflecting generations of mixed ancestry in circumstances that ranged from terrible to merely tragic. But at Fairhope, beginning in 1842, neighbors noticed that the children being born had begun to look remarkably similar to each other and to Mistress Margaret's own sons. Sarah Mlellan, whose plantation bordered Fairhope to the west, mentioned this observation to her husband after Atchich service. In November 1842, her husband, Robert Mlellan, told her not to repeat such speculation. "What happens at Fairhope is Margaret's business," he said. "We don't question how our neighbors run their affairs." This was the unspoken rule of plantation society. You didn't examine too closely what happened behind your neighbor's gates because you didn't want them examining what happened behind yours. The system of slavery created endless opportunities for moral compromise, and survival meant accepting certain hypocrisies. So, when people noticed the light-skinned children appearing at Fairhope with increasing frequency, when they saw how Mistress Margaret kept her sons close to home and away from eligible young ladies in the county, when they heard rumors of strange arrangements in the slave quarters, they chose not to see. They chose not to ask questions because asking questions might require answers and answers might require action and action might threaten the entire system that kept them comfortable and wealthy. But there were people who couldn't choose not to see. The enslaved people at Fairhope lived inside the nightmare that others could ignore. Among them was a woman named Rachel, 23 years old in 1842, who had been born at Fairhope. Rachel worked in the main house as a domestic servant, which meant she saw things that fieldworkers didn't. She saw how Mistress Margaret watched her sons with an intensity that went beyond maternal affection. She saw how the mistress kept ledgers with coded entries, letters, and numbers that seemed to correspond to women in the separated quarters. She saw how young women were called to the main house at night and returned before dawn, sometimes crying, always silent. Rachel couldn't write, but she had a remarkable memory. She remembered faces, dates, conversations. She remembered which women disappeared into the separated quarters and when. She remembered which of Mistress Margaret's sons went where and when. She stored these memories away like a person building evidence for a trial that hadn't happened yet. A trial she couldn't imagine ever happening, but building it anyway because the act of remembering was the only form of resistance available to her. In the summer of 1843, a woman named Dinah was moved into the separated quarters. She was 19, tall and strong from fieldwork with skin the color of polished walnut. The separated quarters housed 8 women by then, ranging in age from 16 to 25. They lived in a single cabin that had been renovated with new timber and a stone hearth. Better conditions than the main slave quarters, which made the other enslaved people resentful and fearful in equal measure. Better conditions meant special purposes meant danger. Dinah had been at Fair Hope since she was 7, purchased along with her mother from a failing plantation in Montgomery. Her mother had died of fever in 1840. Dinah had no family left, which made her vulnerable in ways that even other enslaved people recognized. There was noon to protest if something happened to her. No one whose grief might cause complications. When Dinah was moved to separated quarters, she asked Rachel what it meant. Rachel looked at her with eyes that held both pity and something harder. The kind of knowledge that comes from bearing witness to horror. "It means Mistress got plans for you," Rachel said quietly. They were in the main house kitchen where Rachel was supervising the evening meal preparations. The cook, an older woman named Bess, was kneading dough for tomorrow's bread with steady, rhythmic motions that suggested she was deliberately not listening. "Don't fight it. Fighting makes it worse. Just remember you're still alive. Remember that every day you wake up, you survived another night. Plans?" Dinah's voice was barely a whisper. "What kind of plans?" Rachel glanced at Bess, then back to Dinah. The kitchen was hot from the oven fire, and sweat ran down Rachel's face in steady rivulets, the kind we don't talk about. The kind that make you wish you'd never been born pretty. Just do what she tells you. Keep your head down. Maybe you'll survive it. That night, Dinah was called to the main house. Mistress Margaret met her in the parlor, the room where the Colonel's portrait still hung above the fireplace. The mistress was wearing a dark blue dress, her hair pulled back severely, her face composed in that same expression of careful control that the portrait artist had captured years before. "Dinah," she said, and her voice was pleasant, almost warm. "I've been watching you. You're strong, healthy, you come from good stock. Your mother was an excellent worker before she fell ill. I have plans for you. Plans that will ensure you're well taken care of, better than the field workers. Do you understand?" Dinah kept her eyes lowered. "Yes, mistress." "Look at me." Margaret's voice hardened slightly. When Dinah raised her eyes, she found the mistress studying her with the same intensity that a horse reader might study a promising mare. "You will be given responsibilities, special responsibilities. My son Thomas will explain them to you. You will obey him in all things. You will not discuss these responsibilities with anyone outside the separated quarters. Is that clear?" "Yes, mistress." "Good. Thomas is waiting in the library. Go to him now." Dinah went to the library, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. Thomas Sutherland was 24 years old that summer, a lean man with his father's shite and his mother's careful control. He stood by the window, looking out at the darkening yard, and didn't turn when Dinah entered. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Thomas spoke, his voice low and tight. "Close the door." Dinah closed the door. The library was lined with books that the Colonel had collected over the years. Volumes on agricultural science, histories of the Revolution, collections of sermons. A lamp burned on the desk, casting shadows that seemed to move in the corners. "My mother has a system," Thomas said, still not looking at Dinah. "She believes in efficiency, in maximizing value. She's decided that the best way to increase the value of our holdings is to improve the bloodlines. Do you understand what that means?" Dinah didn't trust her voice, so she just shook her head. Thomas finally turned to face her. His expression was difficult to read. Shame and resignation mixed with something that might have been pleading. "It means she wants the children born here to beef mixed blood, more mixed than usual. She believes it makes them more valuable, more intelligent, more capably skilled work." He paused, swallowing hard. "She's decided that my brothers Andy will contribute to this program." The full horror of what he was describing settled over Dinah like a shroud. This wasn't the common tragedy of enslaved women bearing their masters' children, that was horrific enough, but grimly familiar. This was something more calculated, more systematic. A breeding program designed and managed by a mother using her own sons as tools. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, and he sounded like he meant it. But sorry didn't change anything. Sorry was just a word that comfortable people used when they participated in horror while wishing they didn't have to. You'll stay in this library tonight. In the morning, you'll return to the separated quarters. This will happen regularly until you're with child. Then you'll be moved to a different cabin where you'll be well cared for until the birth. After that, he shrugged helplessly. After that, my mother will decide. Dinina wanted Torin. She wanted to scream. She wanted to set the entire plantation on fire and watch it burn. But she was one woman surrounded by armed white men in a county where enslaved people who rebelled were tortured and killed as examples. So she did what Rachel had advised. She survived the night. This was the system that Margaret Sutherland had created at Fairhope Plantation. It was methodical, documented, and hidden in plain sight. The separated quarters held women selected for their youth and health. Margaret's sons, Thomas, William, and Benjamin, were assigned to different women on a rotating schedule that Margaret tracked in her ledger with clinical precision. The resulting children were raised in a separate nursery, given better food and clothing than other enslaved children, and groomed for positions as skilled workers or house servants. To the outside world, Fairhope appeared successful and well managed. Cotton production remained strong. The enslaved population grew steadily, not through purchase, which required capital, but through what plantation owners euphemistically called natural increase. When neighboring planters complimented Margaret on her management skills, she accepted their praise with gracious modesty. What made this system particularly insidious was how it corrupted everyone it touched. The enslaved women who were forced into the separated quarters had no choice and bore the full weight of the trauma. But they also received marginally better treatment than field workers, which created resentment and division within the enslaved community. Some women, desperate to escape the brutal work of the cotton fields, actually hoped to be selected, a choice that wasn't really a choice, just a different form of horror. Margaret's sons were also victims of her mother's system, though their suffering was of a different magnitude. Thomas, the eldest, had essentially given up his own life and future. He never married. He rarely left Fairhope. He performed his assigned role in his mother's breeding program with visible reluctance but ultimate compliance. William and Benjamin followed their brother's pattern, becoming extensions of their mother's will. Only young Robert, who turned 18 in 1843, resisted. The conflict between Robert and his mother came to a head in January 1844. Robert had been courting Emily Harrison, the daughter of a neighboring planter. The courtship had been proceeding normally. Sunday visits, chaperoned walks, letters exchanged under proper supervision. Robert seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. Then Margaret called him into her study. "You will end this courtship with the Harrison girl," she told him flatly. "I need you here. Your brothers need your help with our program." Robert stared at his mother with undisguised revulsion. "Your program? Is that what you call it, Mother? What you're doing is necessary, profitable, and none of your concern." Margaret's voice was ice. "You're 18 years old, Robert. Everything you have, everything you are comes from this plantation. You will do your duty toward his family just as your brothers do." "My brothers are prisoners," Robert said. "You've made them prisoners. You've made all of us prisoners." Even the he stopped, seeming to struggle with how to finish the sentence. "Even the women in those quarters. Do you understand what you're doing? Do you even care?" Margaret stood up slowly. She was shorter than her son by several inches, but she had a presence that made her seem larger. "You understand that we're alone in this world, Robert. Your father left us debts that you know nothing about. This plantation was failing. I saved it. I built a system that ensures our survival and our wealth. Do you think the Harrison girl's father would let him marry you if he knew we were on the brink of poverty? Everything I've done for this family, not for me," Robert said quietly. "I won't be part of this. I won't." The argument continued for hours, but Margaret Sutherland had not built her system by accepting defeat. Over the following weeks, she systematically destroyed Robert's courtship with Emily Harrison. She spread subtle gossip about financial difficulties at Fairhope. She had Thomas write to Emily's father, suggesting that Robert was unstable, prone to strange ideas and inappropriate sympathies. By March, the Harrison family had cooled considerably toward the courtship. By April, it was over. Robert sank into a depression that worried even his brothers. He spent his days riding across the plantation, avoiding the separated quarters, avoiding the main house, avoiding everyone. At night, he drank in his room. Whiskey purchased secretly from Camden and smuggled home in saddle bags. The household slaves whispered that they heard him crying sometimes late at night when he thought no one could hear, but someone did hear. Rachel, working in the main house, keeping her careful mental records, heard Robert's grief, and recognized in it a possible ally, not an equal. He was still the master's son, still free, still protected by whiteness and maleness in ways she could never be, but an ally nonetheless. Someone who saw the horror for what it was, someone who suffered from it, even if his suffering was different from hers. So, one night in May 1844, when Robert stumbled into the kitchen looking for food after another day of drinking, Rachel took a calculated risk. She was alone. Bess had gone to bed hours earlier and the rest of the house was quiet. "Master Robert," she said quietly. "I need to tell you something." Robert looked at her with blurry eyes. He was 20 years old and looked 40, his face haggard from drink and despair. "Tell me what, Rachel, about what your mother's doing? The full truth of it, because I don't think you know everything. I don't think your brothers know everything." She paused, her heart racing. If she was wrong about him, I've reported this conversation to his mother, she would be sold or worse. She's keeping records, detailed records, not just of when things happen, but of the children, who their fathers are. She's planning their futures, planning to keep them enslaved, even though your half-siblings, even though your blood. Robert sank into a chair at the kitchen table. "I know. God help me. I know. But do you know she's planning to use them, too? The girls when they're old enough. She's already making lists. I seen the ledger. She plans to have your brothers or maybe even you father children with women who are already your daughters." Rachel's voice was shaking now, but she pushed forward. "That's what's coming, Master Robert. That's the future she's building. Generations of it. Blood mixing with blood until nobody knows who they are anymore. Until the evil just keeps multiplying." Robert put his head in his hands. "Stop. Please stop. I can't stop. You can stop her. You're still free. You can still leave here. You can still tell people. Tell them what." Robert's voice was anguished. "Tell them me mother is breeding slaves with her own sons. Tell them I have children in those quarters. Children I'll never acknowledge. Children who will grow up enslaved, who would believe me. And even if they believed me, who would care? You think other plantations are run by saints? You think what happens here is so different from what happens everywhere else? It's the same evil, Rachel, just more organized, more efficient, more honest about what it really is." He was right, and they both knew it. The system of slavery was built in violence and rape. What Margaret Sutherland had created was merely a more systematic version of what happened in fragments across the South. The difference was in the organization, in the careful record-keeping and the multi-generational planning, but the fundamental evil was the same. Still, Rachel tried once more, then helped them escape the women in the separated quarters. Help them run north. You could. I can't. Mother watches everything. And even if some of them escaped, she'd just select new women, the system would continue. The only way to stop it would be to he stopped looking at Rachel with sudden focus despite the alcohol. To destroy it completely, to burn Fairhope to the ground. They sat in silence after that, two people trapped in different chambers of the same hell, equally powerless despite their vastly different positions. Robert eventually stood and left the kitchen without another word. Rachel waited, trembling for the consequences of her boldness, but none came. Robert never reported their conversation, and life at Fairhope continued its terrible rhythm. By 1845, the system was fully operational and expanding. The separated quarters now held 12 women. Margaret's ledger listed 32 children born as part of her program, ranging in age from newborn to 3 years old. The plantation's overall enslaved population had grown to 143 people, making Fair Hope one of the larger operations in Wilcox County. Production remained strong. Financially, Margaret's system was succeeding exactly as she'd planned. But maintaining such a system required constant vigilance and increasing cruelty. Margaret couldn't allow dissent, couldn't allow communication that might expose her operation, couldn't allow any of the women in the separated quarters to form bonds that might lead to collective resistance. So, she rotated them regularly, breaking up friendships. She rewarded compliance with small privileges and punished reluctance with immediate withdrawal of those privileges. She kept them isolated from the broader enslaved community, preventing the formation of any unified response. This isolation was psychological as well as physical. The women in the separated quarters were told repeatedly that they were fortunate, that they had been selected for their superior qualities, that the children they bore would have better lives than field slaves, that their suffering served a higher purpose, the improvement of the race, the increase of value, the economic success that benefited everyone on the plantation. Margaret sold this narrative with conviction, and some of the women, desperate for meaning in their trauma, began to believe it. But not all of them. Dinah, now 21 and mother to a 2-year-old boy whose father was Thomas Sutherland, had never accepted Margaret's narrative. She had learned to perform compliance while maintaining a soar of resistance in her mind. She was also, though she didn't know it yet, pregnant again. This time by William Sutherland, following Margaret's rotation system. On a September even in 1845, when Dinah returned to the separated quarters after another night in the main house, she found Rachel waiting outside the cabin. The two women had developed a careful friendship over the years, communicating in glances and brief exchanges when they crossed paths in the main house or yard. "I'm leaving," Rachel said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "Found a way north. Someone who can help. I wanted to tell you before I go." Dinah felt her heart lurch, half hope, half terror. "When?" "Tomorrow night, new moon. Darkness enough to get to the river." Rachel reached out and squeezed Dinah's hand briefly. "I wanted to ask you to come, but you got a child. Makes running harder. And you're pregnant again," Dinah finished. "I know, been sick the past 3 mornings." She felt tears burning her eyes. "Go, Rachel. Run far and fast. And when you get north, if you can tell somebody, tell them what happens here, tell them everything." Rachel nodded. "I will. I promise you I will. And Dinah, survive. Just survive. Things can't stay like this forever. World's changing. War might be coming. Just survive. Until things change." They embraced briefly, two women holding each other in the darkness, and then Rachel disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, Mistress Margaret discovered her most trusted house servant was missing. The reaction was swift and terrible. Margaret sent her sons and 2 hired men into the woods with dogs. They tracked Rachel for 3 days, finally catching her 15 mi north of Fair Hope, hidden in a hollow tree near the Tombigbee River. What happened to Rachel after they brought her back became another one of Fair Hope's silences. The official record showed that she was sold to a trader heading to New Orleans. But enslaved people at Fair Hope whispered darker possibilities, that she'd been punished so severely she died, that she'd been buried in an unmarked grave in the woods, that Margaret Sutherland had made an example of her that was too terrible to speak about openly. Dinah never learned the truth. She only knew that Rachel was gone and that her promise to tell somebody what happened at Fair Hope had died with her escape attempt. The failed escape had consequences beyond Rachel's fate. Margaret tightened security throughout the plantation. She hired additional overseers, men with hard faces and ready whips who patrolled the quarters at night. She instituted a pass system, making it impossible for enslaved people to move between areas of the plantation without written permission. And she reminded everyone at Fair Hope, in ways both subtle and explicit, what happened to people who tried to leave or who helped others leave. The tightened security made life harder for everyone, but barely slowed Margaret's breeding program. If anything, she intensified it. By 1846, the separated quarters held 15 women, and Margaret had begun selecting girls as young as 15 for inclusion. The children from her program numbered 47. She was, by any measure of plantation economics, succeeding brilliantly. Her wealth grew. Her social position in Wilcox County remained secure, and the system she'd created kept running with terrible efficiency. But systems built on violence and secrecy are inherently unstable. They require constant energy to maintain, constant cruelty to enforce, and they create enemies faster than they can suppress them. By 1847, Margaret Sutherland had made enemies of her own sons, of the women she enslaved, and of the growing number of enslaved men at Fair Hope, who watched the separated quarters with helpless rage. She'd built something monstrous, and monsters always devour their creators. Eventually, just when we thought we'd seen the full extent of Margaret Sutherland's carefully constructed nightmare, the system she created at Fair Hope began revealing even darker layers. If you've made it this far in this story, you understand that some historical horrors deserve to be remembered, not because a theory entertaining, but because forgetting them means allowing them to be repeated. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how unchecked power corrupts. Absolutely, hit that like button to help more people discover these hidden chapters of history. And subscribe so you never miss the dark truths that conventional history books often skip. Because what happened next at Fair Hope Plantation would test the very limits of human endurance and expose the inevitable collapse that comes when evil builds its house on sand. The truth is patient, beauty always emerges. In April 1847, a traveling minister arrived in Wilcox County. His name was Reverend Joshua Hayes, a Presbyterian preacher from Connecticut, who had been traveling through the South for 2 years, conducting revival and preaching the gospel to both white and black congregations where permitted. Reverend Hayes was 53 years old, gay-haired and thin, with the kind of intensity and highs that comes from genuine religious conviction rather than performance. That he was also, though he didn't advertise it openly in Alabama, a believer that slavery was incompatible with Christian principles. Margaret Sutherland invited Reverend Hayes to conduct services at Fair Hope, as was customary when a respected minister passed through the area. She made the invitation partly from genuine religious observance. She attended church regularly and considered herself a moral woman, and partly from social obligation. Refusing to host a traveling minister would have raised questions among her neighbors. Reverend Hayes arrived at Fair Hope on a Sunday morning in late April. He conducted services in the Plantation Chapel, a simple wooden building that the colonel had constructed years earlier. The white family sat in the front pews. Behind them, in a gallery built for the purpose, sat the enslaved people of Fair Hope, those who were permitted to attend, which was perhaps half the total population. As Reverend Hayes preached about righteousness and judgment, about the accountability that all people would face before God, about how no system built on injustice could stand forever, he noticed something strange. The woman who owned Fair Hope, Mistress Margaret, listened with an expression of serene agreement, but her son sitting beside her looked increasingly uncomfortable, and in the gallery, several young women watched him with expressions that seemed to plead for something beyond salvation. They looked haunted in a way that went beyond the normal grief of enslavement. They looked like people who had witnessed horrors that exceeded even the considerable horrors of their situation. After the service, Margaret invited Reverend Hayes to dinner. It was a formal meal served by enslaved people in the dining room where the colonel's portrait still presided over the table. The conversation was pleasant and proper. Margaret spoke about her late husband, about the challenges of managing a plantation alone, about her pride in her son's help with the operation. Thomas, William, and Benjamin contributed little to the conversation, answering direct questions with brief responses and otherwise staying silent. Robert wasn't there. He'd left Fair Hope 3 weeks earlier, according to his mother's explanation, to visit relatives in Mobile. Margaret mentioned this casually, as if his absence was routine and unremarkable. But Reverend Hayes noticed how Thomas flinched slightly when his younger brother was mentioned, and how Margaret's voice hardened almost imperceptibly when she spoke Robert's name. After dinner, as was customary, Reverend Hayes was offered the opportunity to conduct an informal prayer service for the enslaved people of the plantation. Margaret gave her permission with gracious condescension, and one of the enslaved men led the minister to the larger of the slave quarters. Not the separated quarters, Hayes noted, but a different set of cabins closer to the fields. About 40 people gathered as dusk settled over the plantation. They sang hymns, their voices rising in harmonies that carried pain and hope in equal measure. Reverend Hayes preached briefly about perseverance and faith. And then, as he always did, he invited people to speak their troubles aloud if they wished, promising that prayer could ease all burdens. For a long time, no one spoke. Then an older man named Solomon stood up. He was perhaps 60 years old, his hair white, his back bent from decades of field work. "Reverend," Solomon said carefully, "what do you say about a place where the sins are so deep that even speaking them aloud feels like more sin? Where the evil has gone on so long it's become normal? Where people know what's happening but turn away? Because looking at it directly would burn their eyes." Reverend Hayes studied the old man carefully. "I'd say that evil thrives in silence, Solomon. That bearing witness is sometimes the only resistance available to the powerless, and that God says everything, even what men try to hide." Solomon nodded slowly. Then he sat down without saying anything more, but a young woman in the back, Hayes didn't learn her name, stood up next. "Reverend, what happens to the children born from forced unions? Are they blessed or cursed? Are they innocent or do they carry the sin of how they were made?" Hayes felt the weight of the question, the theological and moral complexity it contained. "Children are always innocent," he said firmly. "Always. Whatever circumstances brought them into this world, they bear no guilt for it. God knows each child, knows their suffering, knows their worth." He paused. "But those who force such unions, those who treat human beings as breeding stock, those who corrupt the natural bonds between parent and child for profit, they will answer for it. Before men, if possible, before God, certainly." The young woman sat down. No one else spoke after that, but Hayes felt something in the gathering. A tension, a secret, a shared knowledge of something too terrible to speak aloud, even in the relative safety of this informal service. He made a mental note to investigate further if the opportunity arose. The opportunity came the next morning. Hayes was preparing to leave Fair Hope when Thomas Sutherland approached him near the stables. Thomas looked terrible, hollow-eyed and pale, moving with the careful deliberation of someone barely holding themselves together. "Reverend Hayes," Thomas said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I need to speak with you privately, not here, somewhere away from the plantation. Can you meet me in Camden tomorrow at the courthouse? I'll be there at noon." Hayes studied the young man carefully. "Are you in danger, son?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "We're all in danger, Reverend. Some of us just recognize it more clearly than others. Will you meet me?" "I will." Thomas nodded and walked away without another word, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. The next day, Reverend Hayes waited at the Wilkes County Courthouse in Camden. It was a Tuesday, and the courthouse square was busy with people conducting weekly business. Merchants, farmers, lawyers, and enslaved people running errands for their owners. At precisely noon, Thomas Sutherland arrived looking even worse than he had the day before. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said. They walked away from the courthouse to a less crowded area near the river. Thomas kept glancing around, nervous and agitated. "Reverend, I need to confess something, not to you as a minister exactly, but to you as a witness, someone who might remember and who might someday testify to what I'm going to tell you." "I'm listening, son." And Thomas told him everything. He described his mother system in clinical detail. The selected women, the breeding program, the careful record-keeping, the children born of planned unions between Margaret's sons and the enslaved women. He explained how it had started small after his father's death and grown into something massive and methodical. He confessed his own participation, his shame, his inability to stop it despite his revulsion. My youngest brother, Robert, refused, Thomas said, his voice breaking. He refused to participate. He tried to leave. Mother wouldn't let him. They argued for months. Finally, 3 weeks ago, he stopped swallowing hard. Robert killed himself, hanged himself in his bedroom. Mother found him. She cut him down and told everyone he'd gone tomobile. We buried him at night in the woods, unmarked grave like he was something shameful. Because to her, his refusal was shameful. His death was proof that he was weak. Reverend Hayes felt sick. Thomas, you need to go to the authorities. You need to what? Thomas's voice was sharp. Report my mother for breeding slaves. That's not illegal, Reverend. It's good business. Report her for forcing her sons to participate. There's no law against that either. She hasn't broken any laws. She's just taken the existing laws to their logical conclusion. The system protects her. The system is her. Then you need to leave, get away from Fair Hope. Start a new life somewhere else. I can't. She controls everything. All the money, all the property. I have nothing except what she gives me. And besides, Thomas looked out at the river, his face twisted with anguish. Besides, those children are my responsibility. My sons and daughters. If I leave, who protects them? Who ensures they're treated well? If I abandon them, aren't I just adding another sin to all the others? Reverend Hayes had no answer for that. The moral complexity was staggering. Thomas was both victim and perpetrator, both prisoner and accomplice, both father and enslaver. He was trapped in a web that his mother had woven using the raw materials of slavery itself. And there was no clean way out. Any path forward involved more sin, more suffering, more impossible choices. What do you want me to do, Thomas? Remember, just remember. Write it down if you can. Somewhere safe. Because this system, it can't last forever. Someday, maybe after I'm dead, maybe after everyone at Fair Hope is dead, someone will ask what happened here. And I want there to be a record, a witness, someone who knew the truth and wrote it down. Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. This is my diary from the last 6 years, everything is in here. Take it, hide it, don't show it to anyone while Mother Salive. She'd destroy it and probably hurt whoever has it. But keep it safe for the future, for the accounting that must come eventually. Reverend Hayes took the journal with trembling hands. Thomas, I'll do what you ask, but I'm also going to pray for you for a way out. For salvation in this life, not just the next. Thomas smiled sadly. Pray all you want, Reverend, but God seems pretty quiet these days, at least where Fair Hope Plantation is concerned. They parted after that. Reverend Hayes left Wilkes County the next day, carrying Thomas Sutherland's journal hidden in the bottom of his travel bag. He made copies of the most damning entries and deposited them with trusted colleagues in different cities, creating a distributed record of Fair Hope's secrets. But he didn't go to the authorities. What could he report that would matter? What law had been broken that any court in Alabama would prosecute? Thomas was right. Margaret Sutherland had simply perfected the logic of a system that was already legal and widely accepted. Life at Fair Hope continued. The breeding program expanded. By 1850, the separated quarters held 18 women. The children from Margaret's program numbered 73. Thomas, William, and Benjamin continued their roles in their mother's system, their resistance long since crushed into numb compliance. Robert's disappearance was never questioned by neighbors. His supposed life in Mobile, a fiction that everyone accepted because investigating it would require acknowledging the possibility of something darker. Denina, now 27, had borne 5 children through Margaret's program, 3 by Thomas, to be William. She had learned to survive by separating her mind from her body during the nights in the main house, by focusing on her children during the days, by maintaining a core of self that her enslavers could never quite touch despite their violations. She was also, though she didn't know it yet, teaching that resistance to her children, showing them through example that survival itself was a form of defiance. But survival alone wasn't enough. The women in the separated quarters had begun very carefully and very secretly to communicate among themselves despite Margaret's efforts to keep them isolated. They developed codes, songs with double meanings, ways of arranging laundry to signal messages, brief exchanges during rare moments, often supervised contact. They weren't planning rebellion exactly. They were too pragmatic for that. But they were building something, a network, a collective memory, a foundation for future resistance if the opportunity ever arose. That opportunity came from an unexpected direction. The growing national crisis over slavery itself. By 1855, the entire South was caught up in increasingly bitter conflicts over slavery's expansion into new territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had turned the territories into battlegrounds. Violence was spreading. Political rhetoric was becoming more extreme on both sides. And some enslaved people paying attention to these developments in the limited ways available to them began to sense that the system might not last forever. That change might be coming. At Fair Hope, this growing tension manifested in subtle ways. The white men who visited the plantation, merchants, neighboring planters, overseers looking for work, talked more openly about Northern aggression, about threats to Southern society, about the need to defend their way of life. Margaret Sutherland listened to these conversations with careful attention. She'd built her wealth on slavery's foundation. Any threat to that foundation was a threat to everything she'd created. But she was also aging. She was 57 years old in 1855, and the years of maintaining her system through force of will had taken their toll. She was still formidable, still in complete control of Fair Hope, but she was beginning to think about succession. How would her system continue after she died? How could she ensure that her sons maintained it? How could she protect the investment she'd made in creating a population of mixed-race children trained for skilled labor? The answer, she decided, was documentation. She began creating more detailed records, not just the coded ledgers she'd always kept, but explicit written instructions for how the breeding program should continue. She wrote out the system's logic, its benefits, its procedures. She explained which women should be paired with which men based on their characteristics and bloodlines. She described her multi-generational plan. The children from the first generation would eventually be paired with each other or with new women brought onto the plantation, creating a self-perpetuating system that would increase Fair Hope's value indefinitely. Margaret kept these documents in a locked box in her bedroom. She showed them to Thomas, explaining that he would inherit Fair Hope and the responsibility for maintaining her system. Thomas listened with the dead-eyed compliance of someone who had given up fighting years ago. He nodded when she asked if understood. He promised to continue her work, and he hated himself more completely than he ever had before. But someone else saw those documents. A woman named Hannah, who had been selected for the separated quarters in 1853 at age 16, worked sometimes as a house servant when Margaret needed extra help. On a March day in 1856, while cleaning Margaret's bedroom, Hannah saw the locked box sitting open on the desk. Margaret had stepped out momentarily to speak with an overseer. Hannah couldn't tread well, but she could read well enough to understand what she was looking at. Instructions for breeding, plans for generations of enslavement, her own name, and the names of her friends in the separated quarters listed with notes about their characteristics and reproductive potential. Hannah didn't take the documents that would have been noticed immediately. Instead, she did something cleverer. She remembered. She memorized as much as she could in the brief moments before Margaret returned. And that night, she shared what she'd learned with the other women in the separated quarters. The knowledge of Margaret's written plans changed something fundamental in those women. Before they'd known the system existed, but seeing its multigenerational scope written out explicitly, seeing themselves and their children reduced to breeding stock with calculated futures, crystallized their age in a new way. They began making plans of their own. The plans were modest and practical. They couldn't escape. Security was too tight, and most of them had children they wouldn't abandon. They couldn't rebel openly. The consequences would be swift and fatal, but they could resist in small ways. They could slow down production, they could teach their children to read despite the prohibition. They could maintain their humanity despite every effort to reduce them to mere reproductive capacity, and they could wait for an opportunity. That opportunity came in 1861 when the war finally started. The attack on Fort Sumter in April sent shock waves through Alabama. Men began enlisting in Confederate forces. The careful social order that had kept plantation society functioning began to fray. And at Fairhope, Margaret Sutherland faced her first serious challenge in 20 years. Her sons wanted to enlist. Thomas, William, and Benjamin came to their mother in May 1861 with a unified position. They wanted to fight for the Confederacy. It was, they argued, their duty as Southern men. It was what was expected. Everyone was enlisting, staying home would be shameful. Margaret refused. She needed them at Fairhope to maintain the system. The breeding program couldn't function without them, the war wouldn't last long. Everyone said so, and when it ended, their service to the family would have been more valuable than their service to the Confederacy. The argument that followed was the most serious challenge to Margaret's authority since Robert's Rebellion 15 years earlier. This time, though, Thomas had his brother's support. They were done. The war offered an escape, a purpose beyond the nightmare their mother had created. They would enlist whether she permitted it or not. Faced with this ultimatum, Margaret made a calculation. She could force them to stay, but forced compliance was increasingly difficult to maintain. Asher's sons aged and her own strength waned. Better to let them enlist with her blessing and maintain some influence over them than to have them leave in rebellion. So she agreed, but with conditions: they would return to Fairhope regularly. They would maintain their responsibilities to their children, and they would ensure that the system continued after the war. Thomas, William, and Benjamin agreed to her conditions. In June 1861, all three enlisted in the 10th Alabama Infantry Regiment. They left Fairhope for military service, and for the first time in over 20 years, Margaret Sutherland's system lost its central components. The separated quarters still existed. The women were still there. The children were still being raised according to Margaret's plans. But the men whose participation was essential to the breeding program were gone. Margaret hired overseers to maintain discipline and tried to continue the system using other means. But it wasn't the same. The overseers she hired didn't have the investment in the program that her sons had. They were brutal and efficient, but they lacked the complex emotional investment that had made her sons such effective tools. The system began to deteriorate, and the women in the separated quarters noticed. They noticed the reduced supervision. They noticed Margaret's increasing frustration and desperation. They noticed the war news filtering through the plantation: battles lost and won, territory changing hands, the possibility of Union forces reaching Alabama. They noticed and they waited. The wait lasted 4 years. 4 years of war, of privation, of growing chaos. As the Confederacy collapsed, Thomas Sutherland was killed at Chickamauga in September 1863. William was wounded at Missionary Ridge in November and died of infection 3 weeks later. Only Benjamin survived the war, returning to Fairhope in June 1865, gaunt and traumatized and forever changed by what he'd witnessed. When Benjamin came home, he found Fairhope barely recognizable. Margaret was 67 years old and failing. The plantation was in disarray. The war had ended, slavery had ended. The 13th Amendment had abolished the entire system upon which Margaret had built her empire. The women in the separated quarters were free. The children born through Margaret's program were free. Everyone was free. But freedom was complicated. Where would they go? How would they survive? The infrastructure of slavery was gone, but nothing had replaced it. Most of the formerly enslaved people at Fairhope stayed simply because they had nowhere else to go and no resources to leave. Some became sharecroppers, trading one form of exploitation for another slightly less brutal version. Some left for nearby cities, seeking whatever work they could find. A few headed north, chasing rumors of better opportunities. Dinah stayed. She was 42 years old with 5 surviving children ranging in age from 8 to 20. She had no education, no money, no connections beyond Fairhope. She became a sharecropper on land she'd once been forced to work as a slave, cultivating cotton for a share of profits that never quite materialized. But she was free to leave if she wanted. She had her children with her. She could make decisions about her own life, and she could finally speak. She could tell her children who their fathers were. She could explain what had happened in the separated quarters. She could name the system that had created them and the woman who had designed it. Margaret Sutherland died in November 1865, 6 months after the war ended. She never acknowledged the destruction of her system. She never apologized. She never showed remorse. She died believing she had done what was necessary, that she had been efficient and practical, that history would eventually recognize her genius. She was wrong about that last part. Benjamin inherited Fair Hope, Booth couldn't maintain it. The plantation economy had collapsed. He had no capital to hire workers and no stomach for the sharecropping system that was replacing slavery. In 1867, he sold Fair Hope to a northern speculator for a fraction off its former value. The buyer subdivided the land and sold parcels to various purchasers, including, ironically, several formerly enslaved families who had saved enough to buy small plots. Benjamin moved to New Orleans, where he died of yellow fever in 1869. He never married. He never spoke publicly about what had happened at Fair Hope. The shame consumed him as thoroughly as it had consumed Robert years earlier, just more slowly. The history might have ended there, buried with the people who lived it, except for 3 things. First, Thomas Sutherland's diary still existed. Reverend Joshua Hayes had kept it safe as promised. After his death in 1871, his papers were donated to a Presbyterian seminary library where they sat largely unexamined for decades. Second, the formerly enslaved people who had lived through Margaret's system remembered. They told their children. They told their grandchildren. The stories were passed down through families as cautionary tales, as evidence of what humans could do to each other, as testimony that needed preserving, even when official records remained silent. Third, some of Margaret's own records survived. When Fair Hope was sold, box-off documents were stored in a Camden warehouse. They sat there, forgotten, through Reconstruction, through the Gilded Age, through the early 20th century. Then in 1935, during the Great Depression, the warehouse was being cleared for demolition. A worker found the boxes and, recognizing their potential historical value, donated them to the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Among those documents were Margaret Sutherland's ledgers, her coded entries about the separated quarters, her instructions for maintaining the breeding program, her multi-generational plans for creating a self-perpetuating system of controlled reproduction. Everything Thomas had described to Reverend Hayes was there in Margaret's own handwriting, documented with the same careful efficiency she'd applied to everything. But what made these records particularly chilling was their clinical detachment. The way Margaret had reduced human beings to breeding pairs, assigned numerical values to children based on their parentage, and projected profits across generations as if she were planning crop rotations rather than engineering the systematic violation of dozens of women. When researchers discovered these documents in 1937, they immediately recognized their significance. Here was explicit evidence of something that historians had long suspected, but rarely found documented so thoroughly: the systematic breeding of enslaved people, organized and managed with the same attention to detail that might be applied to livestock. What made Margaret's records unique was their scale, their multigenerational planning, and the horrifying involvement of her own sons. The documents also revealed something researchers hadn't expected: annotations in the margins written in what appeared to be Thomas's handwriting expressing anguish and self-ramation. Brief phrases like, "God forgive me Andy am damned," appeared beside his mother's cold calculations, creating a heartbreaking counterpoint to her methodical evil. The archives initially restricted access to the documents, considering them too disturbing for general research. 3 separate review committees examined the materials and debated whether they should be preserved at all or destroyed to protect the dignity of the descendants of those who had suffered at Fair Hope. The debates were intense and emotional. Some argued that destruction would compound the crime by erasing evidence of what had happened. Others worried that preservation would sensationalize trauma and reduce real people's suffering to academic curiosities. Eventually, a compromise was reached. The documents would be preserved but sealed, accessible only to serious researchers who could demonstrate legitimate scholarly purpose and who agreed to treat the materials with appropriate gravity. They remained sealed until 1947, when a graduate student named Ella Laner Washington, herself a descendant of enslaved people from Alabama, petitioned for access. She argued that understanding such horrors was essential to confronting American history honestly, and that the voices of the victims preserved in depositions and testimony that had been included in the archive boxes deserved to be heard. Her petition was initially denied, then granted after she enlisted support from civil rights organizations and prominent historians who argued that historical truth, however painful, must take precedence over comfortable silence. When Ella Laner finally accessed the documents, she spent 3 months reading every page, often breaking down in tears, as she encountered the testimony of women like Rachel and Inina, whose words had been recorded during brief legal proceedings in the 1860s when some of the formerly enslaved people at Fair Hope had attempted to claim compensation for their suffering. Ella Laner's dissertation, completed in 1951, was the first comprehensive academic examination of what had happened at Fair Hope Plantation. She titled it "The Arithmetic of Evil Systematic Breeding and the Corruption of Family at an Alabama Plantation 1839-1865." The dissertation was controversial, with some scholars questioning whether such explicit examination of sexual violence was appropriate for academic discourse, but Eleanor persisted, arguing that sanitizing history to make it palatable was itself a form of violence against those who had suffered. Her work slowly entered the historical record, cited by other researchers studying the full scope of slavery's horrors, and gradually the story of Fair Hope Plantation became known beyond the sealed archives where it had been hidden for so long. This mystery shows us something profoundly disturbing about human nature. How easily we can construct elaborate justifications for evil when that evil serves our interests. Margaret Sutherland believed she was being practical, efficient, innovative, taking the logic of slavery to its natural conclusion and maximizing her returns. She never saw herself as a monster, just as a widow doing what was necessary to survive in a difficult world. But the system she created was monstrous precisely because it was so methodical, so planned, so thoroughly integrated into the legal and social structures of her time. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Margaret Sutherland saw herself as a monster, or did she genuinely believe she was just being practical? How do we reckon with historical horrors that were legal in their time, but unconscionable be any moral standard? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story affected you, share it with someone who needs to understand that the full truth of slavery was often worse than we imagine. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Stories that challenge us to confront the darkest chapters of American history. Because remembering is the first step toward ensuring such horrors are never repeated. Thank you for listening.